Wolves are often observed occupying landscapes where little visible change seems to occur. They move through valleys, forest edges, and open plains without constant pursuit or frequent attacks. In many cases, large herbivores remain present in the same ecosystem, feeding, migrating, and reproducing in ways that appear outwardly normal. From a surface perspective, nothing about this coexistence immediately suggests large-scale ecological influence. Yet closer observation reveals a pattern that does not align with common expectations. In areas where wolves are known to range, herbivores are frequently absent from locations that still offer abundant forage and water. Riverbanks, open meadows, and low-visibility corridors remain underused, even though these spaces would typically support intensive grazing. This absence is not explained by habitat loss, physical barriers, or seasonal scarcity. The resources remain available, but the animals do not remain. At first glance, this behavior is easy to misinterpret. It may appear inefficient, overly cautious, or even accidental. Without direct evidence of frequent predation, the choice to avoid productive areas can seem unjustified. Traditional explanations that focus only on population control or hunting success fail to account for why these patterns persist when direct encounters are rare. What can be reliably observed is not fear or intention, but consistent changes in movement, timing, and space use. Herbivores adjust where they feed, how long they remain in certain locations, and which routes they repeatedly avoid. These adjustments are systematic rather than random, suggesting an underlying biological logic rather than a temporary response. To understand this behavior, it is necessary to move beyond how it appears at first glance. Only by examining the conditions under which it occurs, the problems it addresses, and the constraints it operates within, can its function be clearly understood. To understand this behavior, we must move beyond appearance and examine how it works. Across multiple ecosystems where wolves are present, a consistent set of observable patterns appears in the behavior of large herbivores. These animals do not distribute themselves evenly across available habitat. Instead, they spend less time in certain locations, despite the continued presence of forage, water, and shelter. Open floodplains, narrow valleys, and river corridors are often crossed briefly or bypassed entirely. When herbivores do enter these areas, they tend to move quickly, remain alert, and exit sooner than they do in other parts of the landscape. This pattern is not limited to a single species or region. Elk, deer, and moose all exhibit similar shifts in space use under comparable conditions. The behavior is not characterized by constant flight or visible distress. Rather, it manifests as subtle adjustments in movement paths, group spacing, and duration of stay. Feeding bouts are shorter, resting occurs more frequently in areas with greater visibility or easier escape routes. Travel routes become less direct, favoring terrain that reduces vulnerability. These observations are most apparent when comparing areas with active wolf presence to nearby regions where wolves are absent or restricted. In the latter, herbivores are more likely to occupy productive sites for extended periods, repeatedly returning to the same locations. In contrast, where wolves range freely, the same sites remain underused despite comparable environmental conditions. This difference persists across seasons and does not depend on immediate predator activity at the time of observation. The conditions under which this behavior occurs point to a response shaped by repeated exposure rather than isolated events. Herbivores adjust their use of space based on the probability of encounter rather than confirmed presence. Movement patterns reflect an ongoing assessment of risk associated with terrain features, visibility, and escape potential. Areas that constrain movement or limit early detection are treated differently from open or elevated ground, even when nutritional rewards are high. From an adaptive perspective, this behavior addresses a fundamental biological problem, reducing the likelihood of capture without abandoning access to necessary resources altogether. By altering where and how long they feed, herbivores reduce exposure during vulnerable activities such as grazing and resting. The behavior does not eliminate risk, but it manages it by redistributing activity across space and time. These adjustments involve clear trade-offs. Shorter feeding bouts reduce energy intake efficiency. Increased movement raises energetic costs. Avoidance of certain habitats can limit access to mineral-rich plants or water sources. Despite these costs, the behavior persists, indicating that the benefits of reduced vulnerability outweigh the energetic disadvantages under prevailing conditions. The persistence of this behavior suggests it is not a temporary reaction but a stable component of how herbivores interact with their environment in the presence of wolves. It represents a functional strategy shaped by natural selection, refined through repeated outcomes rather than conscious choice. Understanding this strategy requires recognizing that what appears inefficient at first glance serves a specific biological function within a broader ecological context. The conditions under which this pattern of space use emerges are closely tied to environmental context rather than constant predator activity. Herbivores do not respond uniformly across all parts of the landscape. Their adjustments are strongest in locations where visibility is limited, escape routes are constrained, or movement speed is reduced. Narrow valleys, dense vegetation near watercourses, and uneven terrain create circumstances in which early detection of predators becomes more difficult. In these settings, even infrequent wolf presence is sufficient to alter behavior. Temporal factors also shape when this behavior is expressed. Herbivores are more likely to avoid risky areas during periods when wolves are typically active, even if no predators are directly observed. Activity patterns shift toward times of day or weather conditions that reduce the likelihood of encounter. These adjustments reflect an association between environmental cues and historical outcomes, rather than real-time assessment alone. The behavior is triggered by context that signals elevated risk, not by immediate threat. Seasonal variation further influences these responses. During periods of abundant forage, avoidance behavior becomes more pronounced, as herbivores can afford to prioritize safety over efficiency. In contrast, during nutritional stress, such as harsh winters or droughts, animals may temporarily re-enter higher-risk areas to meet energetic demands. Even then, use of these areas tends to be brief and cautious, indicating that the underlying avoidance strategy remains intact despite short-term pressure. The presence of young or vulnerable individuals within a group can amplify these effects. Groups containing calves or fawns often exhibit stronger avoidance of constrained terrain, favoring open areas where detection and coordinated movement are easier. This suggests that the triggering conditions are sensitive to internal group composition as well as external landscape features. The behavior adjusts dynamically to both environmental and demographic context. Importantly, this pattern does not require wolves to be visible or recently active. Studies tracking predator and prey movements show that herbivores modify space use based on the broader probability of encounter across time. Areas associated with past predation events or repeated wolf movement become embedded in avoidance routines. These routines persist even when short-term conditions change, indicating that the trigger operates through accumulated experience rather than immediate cues. Human alteration of the landscape can modify these triggers. Roads, open clearings, and developed areas sometimes reduce avoidance by creating zones where wolf activity is less frequent. In such cases, herbivores may concentrate use in human-influenced spaces despite other risks. This highlights that triggering conditions are shaped by the interaction between predator behavior, landscape structure, and external constraints. Together, these factors define the context in which avoidance behavior is activated. It is not a generalized response to predator presence, but a conditional strategy deployed under specific spatial and temporal circumstances. Understanding these triggers clarifies why the behavior appears inconsistent at a surface level while remaining reliable within defined environmental parameters. The functional value of this behavior becomes clear when examined in terms of survival efficiency rather than immediate gain. By reducing time spent in locations where detection is limited and escape is constrained, herbivores lower the probability of capture during their most vulnerable activities. Grazing and resting require sustained focus on resource acquisition, which reduces vigilance, Avoidance of high-risk areas minimizes the overlap between these activities and conditions that favor successful predation. From an evolutionary perspective, this strategy addresses a central biological problem faced by large herbivores: how to acquire sufficient energy while minimizing exposure to predators capable of coordinated pursuit. Wolves rely on terrain, cover, and timing to increase hunting success. By altering space use in response to these factors, herbivores disrupt the alignment between predator tactics and prey vulnerability. The behavior does not eliminate predation, but it shifts encounters toward conditions where escape likelihood is higher. This adjustment also improves predictability at the population level. When individuals within a group adopt similar avoidance patterns, movement becomes more coordinated and less erratic. Groups remain in areas where line of sight is improved, allowing collective detection and response. This coordination reduces the need for constant high-intensity vigilance, conserving energy over long periods. The behavior therefore functions as a compromise between safety and efficiency, balancing competing demands rather than maximizing either. The persistence of this strategy indicates that its benefits outweigh its costs across generations. Individuals that consistently avoided high-risk locations during vulnerable periods were more likely to survive and reproduce. Over time, this resulted in population-level tendencies toward spatial selectivity under predation pressure. These tendencies do not require conscious assessment or learning in each instance. They are reinforced through repeated outcomes and inherited predispositions. Importantly, this function operates independently of predator density at any given moment. Even low encounter rates can maintain selection for avoidance if the consequences of capture are severe. The behavior reduces exposure to rare but high-cost events, a pattern consistent with strategies that evolve under strong selective pressure. In this context, avoidance is not an overreaction but an efficient response to asymmetric risk. The adaptive value of this behavior also lies in its flexibility. Herbivores do not permanently exclude themselves from productive habitats. Instead, they adjust use dynamically based on conditions, entering higher risk areas when benefits are high and withdrawing when risks increase. This flexibility allows access to critical resources without committing to prolonged exposure. The behavior functions as a modulating mechanism rather than a fixed rule. Viewed through this lens, avoidance behavior serves as a biological solution to managing uncertainty. It transforms unpredictable predator movement into manageable spatial constraints. By redefining where and when vulnerable activities occur, herbivores improve survival probability without requiring direct confrontation or constant detection of predators. This function explains why the behavior persists even when its immediate energetic costs are apparent. Despite its adaptive value, this behavior carries measurable costs that limit how extensively it can be expressed. Avoiding productive areas reduces foraging efficiency. Shorter feeding bouts and frequent movement increase energy expenditure while lowering intake rates. Over time, this can affect body condition, particularly in environments where food availability is already constrained. The behavior, therefore, imposes a continuous energetic penalty that must be balanced against the benefit of reduced predation risk. Restricted habitat use also limits access to specific resources. Riparian zones and valley bottoms often contain plants rich in minerals and moisture that are difficult to replace elsewhere. By reducing time spent in these areas, herbivores may experience deficiencies that influence growth, reproduction, or seasonal resilience. These limitations become especially pronounced during periods of high physiological demand, such as lactation or antler growth. When nutritional requirements increase sharply, movement-based avoidance introduces additional risks. Increased travel exposes animals to fatigue and can elevate vulnerability to other threats, including harsh weather or human disturbance. In some landscapes, safer areas may overlap with human-modified environments, introducing new sources of mortality unrelated to predation. The behavior, therefore, shifts risk rather than eliminating it. Trading one set of pressures for another, physiological constraints further shape how avoidance can be expressed. Sustained high levels of vigilance require metabolic investment and can interfere with rest and digestion, While avoidance behavior reduces the need for constant alertness in high-risk areas, it does not eliminate vigilance altogether. Over extended periods, this can influence stress physiology and energy allocation, limiting the extent to which avoidance can be intensified without negative consequences. There are also limits imposed by environmental structure. In homogeneous landscapes with few safe zones, avoidance options are reduced. Herbivores cannot indefinitely exclude large portions of habitat without compromising access to essential resources. In such settings, the behavior becomes less spatially distinct and more reliant on temporal adjustments, such as shifting activity to less risky periods. These alternatives are effective only within narrow bounds. Social structure can amplify or constrain these trade-offs. Larger groups benefit from shared detection but also require greater resource intake, intensifying competition within safer areas. This can negate some of the energetic advantages of avoidance, forcing individuals to accept higher risk to meet nutritional needs. Smaller groups may maneuver more easily but face increased vulnerability during encounters. The behavior, therefore, operates within social limits as well as environmental ones. These constraints explain why avoidance behavior does not escalate indefinitely. It is maintained at a level that balances survival probability against energetic and physiological cost. When conditions shift, such as during extreme weather or resource scarcity, the balance point adjusts. Herbivores temporarily relax avoidance, accepting greater risk to secure necessary resources. This flexibility underscores that the behavior is not a rigid rule but a regulated response, bounded by biological limits. Understanding these trade-offs clarifies why the behavior persists without dominating all aspects of habitat use. It functions as an efficiency strategy, not a guarantee of safety. Its limits are as important as its benefits in shaping how it influences population dynamics and ecosystem interactions. Across different regions, the same pattern of avoidance behavior appears, but its expression varies in response to environmental conditions rather than narrative differences. In large, open systems, such as parts of North America where wolves range across extensive territories, herbivores tend to exhibit broad spatial redistribution. Avoidance zones are expansive, and movement patterns shift at the scale of entire valleys or watersheds. Productive areas near rivers and open plains are used intermittently rather than continuously, creating clear contrasts between frequently occupied and rarely used spaces. In more fragmented or topographically complex regions, such as parts of Scandinavia or mountainous forest systems, the behavior becomes more localized. Herbivores still adjust space use, but avoidance occurs at finer scales. Instead of abandoning entire valleys, animals modify movement paths within them, favoring elevated ground, forest edges, or areas that allow rapid directional change. The same functional principle operates, but the spatial footprint is smaller due to environmental constraints. Climate also influences how the behavior is expressed. In colder environments with prolonged winters, snow depth alters both predator and prey mobility. Herbivores may rely more heavily on compacted trails or windswept ridges. Even when these routes increase exposure, avoidance behavior persists, but it is constrained by the energetic cost of movement through deep snow. In milder climates, where movement is less costly, avoidance can be expressed more consistently across seasons. Human presence introduces additional variation. In landscapes where wolves avoid areas of frequent human activity, herbivores sometimes concentrate use in these zones, despite other risks. Roads, agricultural edges, and developed areas can function as refuges from predation pressure, altering the typical distribution of avoidance. This does not remove the behavior, but it redirects it, demonstrating that environmental context, rather than predator identity alone, determines how risk is managed. Differences are also observed among prey species. Larger-bodied herbivores with lower maneuverability tend to exhibit stronger spatial avoidance, prioritizing early detection and escape routes. Smaller species, capable of rapid directional change, may rely more on vigilance and short-distance flight, allowing them to use constrained habitats more frequently. These variations reflect physical and energetic differences rather than distinct behavioral strategies. Despite these differences, the underlying mechanism remains consistent across regions, climates, and species. Avoidance behavior functions as a response to the probability of encounter under specific conditions. It adapts to local constraints without changing its core purpose. This consistency supports the conclusion that the behavior is not a product of unique circumstances, but a general solution applied flexibly across environments. The comparative perspective shows that behavior adapts to conditions, not to narratives. The same functional logic is expressed differently depending on terrain, climate, and external pressures. Recognizing this variation clarifies why the behavior may appear prominent in some systems and subtle in others, even when the same predator species is present. The expression of avoidance behavior is ultimately bounded by biological limits that prevent indefinite escalation. Anatomical structure places constraints on how animals move, detect threats, and escape. Large herbivores possess body designs optimized for endurance and efficiency, rather than rapid acceleration or abrupt directional change. These traits make prolonged vigilance and constant movement energetically costly. As a result, avoidance strategies must operate within the physical capacity of muscles, joints, and cardiovascular systems. Physiological processes further restrict how risk management can be sustained. Energy budgets are finite, and increased movement or heightened alertness diverts resources away from growth, reproduction, and immune function. During extended periods of avoidance, animals must compensate for reduced intake with increased efficiency elsewhere. This compensation has limits, particularly during life stages that demand high energy investment. When those limits are reached, avoidance intensity cannot increase without compromising survival in other ways. Sensory and neural constraints also play a role. Detecting predators at distance depends on visual acuity, auditory sensitivity, and processing speed. These systems are effective within certain ranges but degrade under low light, dense vegetation, or complex terrain. Avoidance behavior relies on probabilistic assessment rather than constant detection. Because continuous monitoring exceeds cognitive and sensory capacity, this limitation explains why behavior is shaped around terrain features and timing, rather than direct tracking of predator location. Thermoregulation introduces additional trade-offs. Movement patterns that reduce risk may expose animals to temperature extremes, wind, or precipitation. In cold environments, increased movement elevates heat loss, while in hot climates, it raises the risk of overheating and dehydration. These physiological pressures constrain how often and how far animals can relocate to manage risk, forcing compromises between safety and thermal balance. Digestive biology imposes another boundary. Many herbivores rely on prolonged feeding and rumination cycles to extract sufficient nutrients from low-quality forage. Frequent interruption of feeding disrupts these cycles, reducing digestive efficiency. Over time, this can affect body condition and reproductive success. Avoidance behavior, therefore, cannot completely override the need for sustained intake without triggering long-term costs. These constraints ensure that avoidance remains a regulated strategy rather than an absolute one. The behavior persists because it operates within tolerable limits, not because it eliminates danger entirely. When environmental or physiological pressures intensify, the balance shifts, and animals temporarily accept higher risk to meet essential biological needs. This adjustment reflects the reality that survival depends on managing multiple demands simultaneously, rather than optimizing a single outcome. By recognizing these limits, the behavior can be understood as a product of compromise rather than control. It is shaped by what bodies can sustain, what energy systems can support, and what sensory capacities can reliably detect. These biological boundaries define the space within which avoidance behavior operates and explain why its influence, while powerful, remains conditional. Observing this behavior closely reveals how easily initial impressions can be misleading. What may appear inefficient or overly cautious at first glance follows a clear biological logic once examined through function rather than assumption. by adjusting space use, timing, and movement. Herbivores manage exposure to rare but high-cost events within the limits imposed by their bodies and environments. This strategy does not eliminate risk, nor does it maximize resource intake. Instead, it reflects a balance shaped by evolutionary pressure, energetic constraint, and environmental context. Which aspect of this behavior challenged your assumptions the most? The way space is avoided, the conditions that trigger adjustment, or the biological limits that shape its expression? And which other animal behavior should be examined next through this lens of observation and analysis?